This is Stan. It's actually an acronym for salty and tan. His full name is Stan Jacked. In reality, this is my man Stan Efferding, which you've probably seen on this channel a little bit, but he is like one of the only people that I can candidly talk salt with. Is you are a big salt guy, you're not a salty guy, but you're a big guy on salt. so I know you've got a lot to say. I want to let you, you do most of the talking here and explain.
Yeah, I've talked a lot about salt and its benefits for performance. Obviously, important for hydration, energy, stamina, endurance. I find that your workouts can last longer, tend to recover better, and so I would recommend salt. But primarily for this reason, because I know people immediately start to be concerned that salt is going to cause a heart attack or lead to high blood pressure or something like that. And there's a small percentage of the population, and it kind of depends on who you ask, somewhere between 10 to 25% possibly, that are salt sensitive, they're hypertensive. And generally the bulk of those people are overweight, which we know is a big contributor to high blood pressure. And so this conversation isn't for those people.
Yeah.
If you're sedentary and have a history of heart disease or are hypertensive, then you shouldn't be consuming a lot of salt. But for the vast majority of the population, and particularly those people who aren't eating, health conscious people, you're not eating fast food, you're not eating a lot of packaged food, it's not only healthy, but probably recommended, particularly if you're keto and intermittent fasting, that you add back some salt to your diet, to put some on your food, which has been demonized for so long. It's even more important in the fitness industry, of course, because those people, those active individuals who are training sometimes up to twice a day, are sweating a lot, and people sweat out sodium, sweat out salt. And so you may need to take in even more salt to compensate for the amount that you lose during training. So, I mentioned this many years ago. I've used this as a strategy. A lot of bodybuilder, figure physique, and bikini people will avoid salt. And you find out that they get really tired, and that salt and water and carbohydrates are a pretty important part of muscle fullness, which in that industry is paramount. I also found it was great for performance for athletes who had high workloads, CrossFitters who were doing 2-a-day trainings, or strong men, and even bodybuilders have a pretty significant workload, and they'll sweat out a lot. I work with Layne Johnson from the Philadelphia Eagles. He sweats out 5 grams of salt an hour.
Wow.
And it's hard to replace that. So you need to make sure, because you can't do it in one bolus, because your stomach can never be able to tolerate that much salt in one dose. And so, we would have to set up a diet program that allowed him to get his salt back. They're actually monitored, the Philadelphia Eagles are actually monitored by Dr. Sandra Godick, and she's the president of the Heat Institute. She's a PhD in thermoregulation and hydration. And one of the things that she does is she salt tests her athletes using a patch to see how much salt they sweat out in a given hour.
No kidding.
Yeah, and then she designs a rehydration program that's specific for them.
Whoa.
To be able to get them to recover from all the salt that they sweat out. And so I've made that recommendation to my athletes, the CrossFitters. I worked with a lot of top CrossFitters, national champions, Camille LeBlanc and Becca Voigt and Ben Smith. And salt was a pretty important part of the diet program that we designed for them. And like in the National CrossFit, the Reebok Championships, Camille, for instance, she would take 1,000 milligrams of sodium before and after each of the longer events. And over the course of 5 days of competing, she gained a pound of body weight instead of historically she had lost a significant amount of weight. Rehydrating athletes after training is a kind of a specific science now. You hear Dr. Andy Galpin talking about it a lot. The International Society of Sports Nutrition and the NSCA all have recommendations for about every kilo of body weight you lose, which is about 2+ pounds. You need to replace about 1 liter to 1.5 liters, more water actually than you sweated out. And that water should include a percentage of salt. 500 milligrams of sodium is what's recommended, up to 1.5 grams depending on your sweat rate. And so salt can be, I should define salt and sodium. Salt is sodium chloride. Yep. And so sodium is 40%, chloride is 60%. And so if I say that somebody takes in 500 milligrams of sodium, then that's about 1.2 grams of salt. So I don't want to confuse those terms in terms of what people are getting. The average person in most countries, kind of worldwide, consumes about 3.5 to 5 grams of sodium a day in a normal diet. The Chinese seem to consume a little more than that. There's been some research recently that suggests that those who are hypertensive, who have a history of heart disease, should limit their salt intake, and they would realize an improvement in all-cause mortality. But for people who aren't salt sensitive, there's no indication, no research to suggest that that's necessary. And so we hate to fearmonger people away from who are trying to eat healthy into purposely avoiding salt, because it has all those potential benefits. I, as a personal trainer for 30 years, trained thousands of clients. Many times that have clients come to the gym, and maybe you get a middle-aged or an upper middle-aged woman that would get on a leg press and do a set and go to stand up and have to hold on to something and be dizzy. My parents are elderly. When they would try to limit sodium to too much of a degree, they would feel a little dizzy from standing up from a seated position. Reintroduce some salt, presuming it didn't create a significant elevation of blood pressure, they feel better. And that's important. And plus, there's also a lot of things that are a lot more effective for reducing blood pressure than sodium restriction. Again, unnecessary for people who aren't hypertensive, but for those who are, weight loss. Even in the sodium restriction diets, like the study in China or the DASH diet, they see an average reduction in blood pressure of about 3 millimeters of systolic blood pressure, not significant. You can get about a millimeter of systolic blood pressure reduction from 1 pound of weight loss. A 20-pound weight loss could be 20 points. And in the industry that I've worked in for many years, of course, you'd see a lot of huge bodybuilders and powerlifters and strongmen with blood pressures that would, most, I think, publicly was Mark Bell when his blood pressure was 190, his systolic blood pressure. And we brought that down very quickly to under 140 within just a period of weeks with some weight loss, which is one of the big things. Getting a CPAP is another one that's huge. You could knock almost 20 points off of your blood pressure by getting a CPAP for people with apnea who hold their breath at night. Thyroid regulation. People who are hypothyroid tend to have an elevation in blood pressure that's much more significant than the 3 millimeters you'd see from sodium reduction. And then getting adequate micronutrients. Potassium is one of the keys. Probably the big reason the DASH diet shows a benefit with sodium reduction. The DASH diet is a 30-day trial on hypertensives, and so those people tend to have a more significant loss of or reduction in blood pressure from sodium restriction, whereas you wouldn't see that in the average in the population that wasn't hypertensive. But B, and the DASH diet recognizes this themselves, it's in their summary, that they have a significant increase in fruits and vegetables, i.e. potassium. And also magnesium and also calcium. So it's not any one thing. It's a host of things. I put a high blood pressure quick fix kit in my book that goes down all of those in terms of order of importance. We should also mention that it's not a more is better scenario. That again, if you take in too much sodium in one bolus, for lack of a better description, you're going to piss it out your ass. You're going to get diarrhea. It's like drinking ocean water. So just putting a 1/4 teaspoon of salt, that's about 500 milligrams of sodium, in with some water, potentially some carbohydrates pre-workout just to help with absorption if you wanted to take a little bit of, that's why a lot of these sodium hydration powders have a little bit of carbs in them because it kind of helps with the uptake.
Now today's video is sponsored by a company called LMNT, which is my preferred electrolyte. My personal favorite flavor is the mango chili flavor and also the lemon habanero. But there's a link down below that you can get a free sample pack of LMNT electrolytes, a free sample pack. So that gets you like 8 sample packs to try. You just pay shipping. So this is really cool. It's awesome for my viewers, for my subscribers. Big thank you to LMNT. They're a tremendous supporter on this channel. So you go to drinklmnt.com/Thomas. Again, drink, D-R-I-N-K, lmnt.com/Thomas, and that'll take you to a page where you can get a free sample pack and try these out. So again, if you're fasting, if you're doing keto, it just makes life easy. It gives you something to sip on. The lemon lime flavor is awesome, the mango chili. Anyhow, that link is down below. Check them out after this video, and a thank you to LMNT for the support.
And you take that about 30 minutes to an hour before a workout. If you need more salt, then you would titrate it. You would take 500 milligrams an hour before, 500 milligrams 30 minutes before, rather than 1,000 milligrams at once if it would cause any discomfort. With water, usually diluted in about 24 ounces of water or so. And then you come to your workout, you've got more hydration, obviously a greater blood volume, so that when you're working out and the blood starts dispersing through the muscles, that you've still got adequate hydration for the blood. And you can train longer. You hit the wall. You don't hit the wall as fast, and you can maybe just get in an extra set or a couple extra reps. It's not like it'll give you a strength boost. It's not the intent. The intent is really to be able to do a little more consistently and to recover a little faster from that work. Well, so just because people get so, to steal a word from Dr. Peter Atita, phosphorylated about this topic. This morning, was before I jumped on a plane to come up here, I printed out, this isn't Stan Efferding saying this, like I mentioned, the ISSN, Dr. Andy Galpin, Dr. Sandagodik from the Heat Institute. Here's Alan Aragon, what the science really shows. It says there's no reason for people with normal blood pressure to reduce their sodium intake. He mentions that if you have high blood pressure, then you should reduce your sodium intake. And he also mentions here that you're better off consuming more potassium-containing foods, which we tend to underconsume anyhow in general, and it's fantastic for performance and a host of other things. Potassium is also great for performance. It's great for constipation. It's great for heart arrhythmia. There's just so many benefits to potassium, and we don't consume enough. But that's what he mentions here, and that's Alan Aragon. He says, strive for a potassium-rich diet, which you can get by eating more fruits and vegetables or legumes, and try and get your 4,700 milligrams a day. Dr. Layne Norton, sodium is not a problem. It's a critical nutrient for every cell in your body. It's responsible for creating action potentials in your nervous system associated in epidemiology with heart disease, but that is due to the healthy user bias. Yes. People who tend to eat more sodium eat more processed food. Those people tend to eat more food overall. They weigh more, drink more, smoke more, exercise less. And that's confounding variables from that. He says that an increase in sodium consumption would just increase the kidneys, in a healthy individual, the kidneys will just increase sodium excretion, and vice versa. So
stop right there, because that's such a good point, because people think automatically when they have salt, I don't want to get puffy, I don't want to get bloated, I don't want to, and although that can happen,
maybe initially, especially if you're depleted, and it'll regulate.
And that's just the thing is, like, you develop a tolerance, I shouldn't say a tolerance, but your body will adjust. Like when you first load sodium, yes, you might get puffy, but eventually the body learns how to regulate. You excrete what you're not utilizing, and that puffiness. I speak for myself, because I can just go on record to say how much sodium I consume. I'm about 185 pounds. I consume on a workout day probably about 7,000 milligrams of sodium, which most people would say, oh my gosh, you're gonna.
I mentioned that in the medical community when ape, because those numbers seem pretty extraordinary in comparison to what the average consumption is, but with no regard for your workload, for the humidity, for your sweat rate, for the
low carb
temperature, all of that. But like you said, if you decrease sodium, your body's just going to increase aldosterone and retain water, and you're going to have the same blood sodium level.
I noticed that
very tightly
when I was back to back photo shoots for a period of months. Constant sodium depletion, and it got to a point where it wasn't working anymore. Depleting sodium made me retain water. And what would normally work before in sort of an acute situation where I would say, I'm going to cut water or I'm going to cut sodium, sure, you might dry out a little bit, but then if that becomes a repeat thing, eventually that doesn't work anymore. So
Layne Norton said the same thing. He's got clients that consume over 10,000 milligrams of sodium a day, and their health markers are normal. Eric Trexler at Mass Research Review did a review of some of the work by Robin Felder, who's from the University of Virginia. The sodium heart disease risk is through sodium's increase in blood pressure. So that is important for hypertensives. But for people who don't have a concurrent increase in blood pressure, it's of no concern, because that's the mechanisms. It's not that salt's bad for you, it's that salt may raise blood pressure in a small percentage of people, and those people should be cautious, or introduce more potassium, or lose some weight, or get a CPAP, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of other options that would have a more significant impact. Only relevant for salt-sensitive individuals, even if it's dose-dependent, salt concentration-dependent, potassium, calcium, and magnesium. This is what Eric mentioned. He says 25 to 30% of the population is salt-sensitive. There's also 5 to 15% of the population who's inverse salt-sensitive, and they get elevated blood pressure from reducing sodium intake.
Wow.
So you got to be cautious.
That's a new one, yeah.
There's a couple other studies here I don't need to go over. They say the same thing. Most countries have an average intake of about 3.5 grams a day, and it's very individualistic. Dr. Sandagrotik's work, which I already mentioned. Dr. Aaron Carroll has a great website, or great YouTube, Healthcare Triage. He's a dean of research for Indiana, and he's an MD. And has a video that says low salt diets probably don't prevent heart disease. And a meta-analysis in JAMA said there was no data that showed salt restriction reduced mortality or cardiac disease. Clyde Yancy, professor of cardiology from Northwestern School of Medicine. Evidence for sodium restriction is vacuous, lacks depth, and in some cases lacks integrity. Salt avoidance, he said there's more helpful measures, all the ones we just mentioned. Rather than avoiding sodium, you should use those other methods that we mentioned. We already talked about the DASH diet. We already talked about the Chinese study. It was also on hypertensives. Cochrane review, one of the most reputable organizations to review. Salt as well, I'll see if I could just summarize here. Showed no strong evidence of benefit. Salt restriction increased the risk of all-cause mortality in those with heart failure. We found no information on the participants' health-related quality of life from reducing sodium. No evidence of any effect on salt reduction for cardiovascular disease morbidity in people with normal blood pressure. So these are all, this isn't me saying this.
Yeah.
You know, this has been my experience. That's my anecdote. It's been the testimonials of the clients I've worked with and bumped up against, I think, some of the most respected researchers in the industry. It's not to be of concern for those people who don't have hypertension.
Interesting. Yeah,
That'd be a great benefit.
Yeah, it's absolutely. I mean, that's what I've experienced, and especially as someone, you know, when you're keto or fasting, this is what ends up happening is you're in the
bingo.
There's less insulin, your kidneys are expelling more water, so you run into that situation even more. And from a strength perspective, I will say, as far as workouts are concerned, that it can make a difference, and at least I experience it in my strength, and I think for a low carb or a fasting individual, it comes down to intracellular volume of the muscle too. Like if being so glycogen depleted, it's simple physics that if you have less overall muscle mass because you're not retaining some water in the muscle, then that's less leverage that's giving you strength. So it's literally the difference between having a flat muscle that doesn't have much contractile tissue to a volumized muscle. That's why, you know, muscle pump supplements, I say with air quotes, work in the sense that, you know, you're getting more internal leverage. Like it's not necessarily the biomechanic or the biochemistry of it more so as it is simple physics. So when you have a bigger muscle, bigger belly, it's going to be a stronger lever arm. So I noticed that with this. But another interesting piece that is not touted a lot in the even in the low carb world, but sodium and how it works in terms of the nervous system as far as the brain, because there's these things called NST neurons, and these NST neurons in our brain are designed to sort of limit when we should. They sort of communicate in terms of salt load, and they communicate with aldosterone, and they communicate with these things. Well, when we are craving sweets, a lot of times people find, I find this with clients and myself, we're actually craving salt. And it's not like the lines are literally getting crossed, but what's happening is that these NST neurons, when they actually get a signal from salt, then suddenly the cravings for sweet tend to go away. So with people that are fasting, that like me, I do like sweet things, I'm not afraid to admit, and when I'm fasting, that sometimes is the tough one. I'll say, quick plug for these guys, this is called LMNT, which is an electrolyte that I use. But like when I'm fasting, when I'm doing keto, anything like that, I sip on this stuff not just because it tastes good and it gives me something to sip on and because I know it's doing me some good, but I feel like I'm actually getting and curbing my cravings. And maybe it's just the act of consuming something. Maybe there is something to the whole NST neuron piece, but I've talked to, I can't even count how many people that have experienced the same thing. And sometimes it's as simple as just adding salt to their water. I mean, don't get me wrong. You don't have to, buy a packet. I just think these taste good. So I mean, but it's definitely one of those things where people notice a difference with that.
You hit the nail on the head. You sip on it, maybe take in a bolus 30 minutes before training, and then you sip on it throughout your workout and finish it following. Has all the benefits we just mentioned. That's a recommendation for people, particularly in any endurance event that might go over 90 minutes, is that about every 20 minutes you should consume a salt, carb, water blend. You see those goos and stuff that people use. This would be a perfect adjunct to an extended cardiovascular event. Even the ISSN recommends that as well. Just about every 20 minutes or so, you take a small portion, you just drink a little bit, and that helps extend and improve performance and extend the duration of which you'd be able to train.
Interesting. And you know what else is wild is I remember seeing a while back, maybe you can tell this is the study, but where it's like humans, or all mammals, I guess, when you put a salt lick out for livestock, that they inherently know to go to it. That just gives an indicator of how important salt is. You can put a salt lick out in the middle of a pasture, and yes, they might investigate it because they're curious what it is, but then they've demonstrated that this is something that animals just gravitate to. It's a natural need, even for all of us. And when our diets are so regulated by what is in a packaged food, it's hard for us to be in charge of our salt intake. And I think that's kind of the common theme here is you need to take charge of your salt intake because you can't rely on some foods to do it for you or other foods not to. It's just you need to be in control of it yourself because right now we're just leaving it up to whatever's in a packaged food.
You've got a healthy population that listens to you, your viewership,
Yeah.
and they exercise. They're active individuals. You don't have to be an athlete to benefit from this. They avoid processed food and fast food as much as possible to live an active lifestyle or to live a healthy lifestyle. But we've demonized it. It's a good food, bad food thing. Now salt is bad,
Yeah.
Because it's typically associated with processed food. It's typically associated with people who overeat and again are overweight and inactive. So it's important, and your audience I think would benefit most from this recommendation because they're probably not hypertensive. They probably are active and sweat every day and probably don't eat a lot of processed food or packaged food. It's okay to
Yeah.
salt back. And then people are going to ask what kind of salt. Well, Dr. Aaron Carroll wrote a book called Good Food, Bad Food, and he said really it doesn't matter that much. I know people talk about wanting to get like Himalayan salt because of all the minerals.
Yeah.
The minerals are not
Negligible amount.
They're negligible.
Yeah.
It's not meaningful. It's not we talk about potassium. You need 4,700 milligrams a day. So yeah, if it tastes good to you, great. The problem with like a pink salt is it lacks iodine.
Yeah.
And that's where I sometimes kind of, depending on an individual's iodine status or their thyroid status, you got to get iodine from somewhere. You can get some from egg yolk, you can get some from milk, but maybe not enough if you're an active individual because you sweat out iodine as well.
Yeah.
And so it might be important for you to feed back some of that iodine. Now, not a ton, you only have 125 microgram daily recommended allowance, but that's again for an inactive individual, probably 140 pound female, middle-aged. But I wouldn't suggest going over a gram a day. It's 1,000 micrograms, or 1 milligram, I'm sorry, a day. So it's not like you have to take iodine supplements, but you might use some iodized salt in conjunction with some foods that are higher in iodine, like
Seaweed is great.
Seaweed, kelp. It's funny is that Vince Gironda talked about this in the 70s when he was getting bodybuilders to eat kelp for the iodine because they knew they were sweating it out and they were becoming, maybe thyroid deficient, hypothyroid. So yes, a table salt. I know it's bleached and I know it's got caking agents. Not terribly significant, to be honest with you. And at some point, in order to get the nutrients that are necessary, we have to use the resources that are available. It made a huge difference both in birth defects and in cognitive impacts, IQ for unborn, pregnant women in particular, particularly in that first trimester, which is it's hard sometimes. You might avoid something like table salt in the first trimester, and that's when you need the iodine the most for brain health. So there's a lot of good reasons to get a sufficient amount, and it might be causal of some hypothyroidism. It's not always the case. But it's also, again, part of the digestive process. The iodine is part of the pathway to create hydrochloric acid. So there's a lot of benefits to it, and I wouldn't demonize table salt at this point. It doesn't seem to make that big of a difference.
No, I totally agree. So with all that, stay salty, and I will see you all tomorrow. Thank you, Stan, for hopping on. It's always a pleasure. And where can everyone find you?
StanEfferding.com is my website. I've got links on there to my meal prep company, The Vertical Diet, delivers nationwide. Stan Efferding is also my Instagram, and Stan Efferding is my YouTube. And we've got the Vertical Diet ebook on my site, as well as the hard copy on Amazon and at Barnes & Noble.
Beautiful. Well, thank you all.